Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, we'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal peoples of the land upon which we meet this afternoon. Secondly, I'd like to warmly welcome every one of you. Isn't it marvellous to be back to having a real face-to-face meeting? We're delighted to see you all here, and we're particularly delighted to see our special guests, Mary Kuloff and her husband Grady, who've made the effort to come up from Hobart to be with us on this first lecture of our 2021 series and our first face-to-face lecture for almost 12 months. So it's wonderful to have you here. Now, I know I don't have to tell an audience like this to turn off your mobile phones, so I won't. There are two exits at the back. They're both wide, and there is an emergency exit at the side, which I'm sure we won't need any of them, but that's where they are. And the restrooms are around in the main corridor just beyond the desk. Thank you all for complying with the COVID regulations. I'm sorry you can't sit closer together, but you look a big audience from here. This is the rules, and one of the, I don't think there's many benefits from COVID, but one of the benefits for the committee here is that we don't have to stack the chairs afterwards. The staff of the QV Mag will clean them all up and stack them away, and we don't have to do that. So for those of you that were regular stackers and when we were regularly meeting, have a rest at the end of the presentation. It's a great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Professor David Bowman. He is going to talk about pyrogeographic thinking, the key to tackling the global fire crisis. Professor Bowman holds a research chair in Pyrogeography and Fire Science in the School of Natural Sciences and is a director of the Transdisciplinary Fire Centre at the University of Tasmania. He is developing the transdisciplinary field of pyrogeography that provides a synthetic understanding of landscape burning, uniting human, physical and biological dimensions of fire from the geological past into the future and spanning local to global geographic scales. So I'm certain that with all the bushfires that we've experienced and the world is experiencing, we will get a great deal of very interesting information. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor David Bowman.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I love coming up to Northern Tassie, so it's fitted in really nicely, and I'm looking forward to hopefully being able to give this talk. When it emerges. Yep, okay. So, and that would advance it on that button. Yep. So, yeah, pyrogeography, it's not, I didn't invent the word, but I co-opted it. And I co-opted it because I really needed a handle to explain what I do. In my line of work, I'm an academic, and if you don't know much about academics, there's two sides to academia. There's the public side and there's the dark art, private side, which anonymous reviewers are continually keeping you honest and sometimes insult you. And, when you're writing grant proposals, oh, this Bowman guy, is a dilettante. He's just playing on the margins, he doesn't have any focus. He doesn't know what he's doing. And I actually thought about that, and it's sort of like, fair enough, because if you look at my body of work, and I've published almost 500 journal articles, I've published in collaboration with people as different as linguists, anthropologists, geochemists, archaeologists, plant biologists, molecular ecologists, you know, climatologists. You don't believe me, you know, look at my publication record in Google Scholar. It is actually a very strange publication record. What the hell is this guy doing? And in the end, you have to explain that. Otherwise, I'm just, you know, I am like a scientific butterfly, just alighting on this and, you know, doing that. Or there is actually a core coherence here. And my purpose today is to prosecute an argument. And I'm going to put myself on trial, and I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to tell you what I do is deadly serious, deadly serious. I'm going to explain to you that there is a very clear systematic logic with what I do and why I do it. Then I'm going to do something many academics don't do. I'm not going to problematize. Problematizing is easy. You know, it's incredibly easy to identify a problem. You know, it's actually, it's also, I might add, it's incredibly easy to write a scientific paper to a certain degree, particularly if you identify a problem. It's way, way harder if you go and say, I'm in the business of problem solving. I'm actually going to solve problems, or I'm going to challenge myself to solve problems. And in a global emergency, and to a certain degree, my discipline, my practice, my craft in my life has gone from curiosity-driven research to a crisis discipline. I am involved in a crisis discipline. I gave evidence to the Royal Commission. You know, this is my business now. You know, I work with insurance companies. This is my business. Now that's spanning in one life or in one, you know, research career, going from you know, being a guy who just likes going into nature, and I still do, and I try to go into nature as much as possible, to suddenly finding yourself right in the epicenter of something, you know, really quite significant globally and certainly nationally. So, oh, that's odd, I didn't think that would be there. Anyway, I thought I'd change this around, but that doesn't matter. And I have no idea why that's there, but what has happened is that we're seeing an apocalyptic view of, I hope my slides aren't all chaotic, we're seeing an apocalyptic view of fire. This is in California. So we're seeing Paradise burn. Paradise, the town of Paradise in California, is about 80,000 people, was basically incinerated by these extreme fire. And, you know, the Tasmanian wilderness fires, you know, another sort of paradise is getting burnt. And what we're seeing is that these fire events globally, the red bars are the total fatalities and the number of fatal fire events and the economic losses in the blue bars and the wildlife disasters are all climbing steadily. And the weird thing is that they're climbing steadily despite the fact that we're spending an enormous amount of money fighting fires. So there's a spiraling firefighting cost. And what we're also seeing is that these, if you look at the red triangles, particularly in the southeast corner of Australia, that we did an analysis of where, you know, really major extreme fire events, we used a satellite estimation of really the most extreme fire events on Earth in a 20-year record. And we were able to identify, using a verification process, disasters. And you can see it, particularly in southeastern Australia, but certainly on the west coast of the United States and also in the Mediterranean, European Mediterranean region. There are these clusterings now of fire disaster events, and they're actually, the underlay on that, the colouring, is the shading as areas that are likely to be experiencing worsening fire weather. So we're seeing a problem that not only that there are disasters, but the disasters are likely to get worse because of climate change. So I want to, that's what I thought I'd be starting off, but touch on what happened in last year. Last year, you know, it was really a very, very strange event, which, you know, the subject of the Royal Commission. That's a banana plantation. And you know, a lot of people have used koalas or, you know, burnt landscapes or whatever. I really think, you know, what a powerful icon for an extreme fire event. A banana plantation being basically, well, not incinerated, but being scorched to an inch of its life. And as you know, or may not know, bananas are a giant herb. They're very succulent things, and they grow in the subtropics. And if somebody had said to you, you know, 18 months ago, oh, there's going to be banana plantations which are going to be severely impacted by a bushfire, you'd pretty well burst out laughing. It's just a ridiculous idea that a banana plantation could be impacted. But they were. And what we found in an analysis that we looked at these fires is a really strange thing about them, that for all of the other biomes in Australia, the fire season was average. There was no statistical departure historically in a 20-year record. The big action, look at that giant bar, this massive deviation occurred, that those fires were a phenomenon of eucalypt forest. They were a eucalypt forest phenomenon. Now, that is astonishing and interesting, but it also scares me witless, because I have been watching and working on the mainland, seeing landscapes which are very reminiscent of Tasmanian landscapes, not only incinerated once, but now incinerated up to 3 times. They've been incinerated so often that the eucalypts are now collapsing. Even the vegetative resprouting eucalypts are actually beginning to collapse. So if you've been to the mainland and you know, like, you know, the Bogong High Plains, the snow gums are now, you know, they've been burnt so often that they're not actually able to regenerate anymore. And there seems to be a biological reason for that, is that they are just simply exhausted from the sustained dryness and reduced productivity. Their carbohydrate reserves are being exhausted, their capacity to bounce back. So we're all sitting around thinking, oh, eucalypts just bounce back. Well, actually we're beginning, and I might add, there's a very significant, well, there's 2 significant jeopardies for Tasmania for that assumption. Jeopardy number 1 is, I have every reason to believe that these gigantic fires that I've seen in the Australian Alps are going to visit here. And bear in mind that 25% of the island has been burnt by fire since the turn of this century. But those really big fires, which we saw one on the Central Plateau, fortunately haven't really affected, you know, the environs of Hobart or around Launceston. But when they come, you know, we're talking about these extreme deviations. And the second jeopardy is that the assumption that the Tasmanian government is like to say that, you know, we're carbon neutral because of forests. Well, actually, yeah, maybe, but maybe not, because the capacity of the forests to store carbon, it's been compromised by this increased fire activity. So there were a phenomenon well, what was the cause for this? Why is that not working? Maybe we're going to do that. So yeah, they were historically unprecedented. Scale of these fires, it's difficult because as you go back in time, the fire record is much worse, but these were, you know, incredible fires that spanned, you know, from southern Queensland all the way down to Victoria. These were massive, massive fires that, as far as we know, we certainly know in the satellite record there's no precedent, but in the written historical record, I have every reason to believe there's no precedent. So what was the cause of these extreme fires? Well, one cause, and there, if I remember correctly, those bands, the grey and the darker grey, standard deviations. And there's just enormously dry, anomalously dry landscape. So the fuels were very, very dry, which meant that when the fires were burning in the forests, they just didn't encounter anything to stop them. So they'd burn straight through rainforests, straight through creek lines. So it was basically all you needed was an ignition, and you had this, this like explosive growth of these fires that could just burn and burn and burn. And they did, they burnt for months. Now, the fire intensity was completely off the charts with the satellites. The satellites have now quite good sensors for intensity. And yeah, these things, again, in the satellite record, just totally anomalous. These things were not all, but many of these fires during their runs were very, very extreme, like super extreme. In fact, like atomic bombs. And those atomic bombs, the pyro-CBs, which is a pyrocumulonimbus, probably some of you have heard of pyro-CBs. If you haven't, you will. Pyro-CBs, were really meant to be a theoretical thing, not really known. Tasmania's experienced one pyro-CB, which was the fire at Dunalley. It's the only known pyro-CB, again, constrained by the scientific record. But you could see, grumbling along, there is a team of experts who have a list of pyro-CBs. They very kindly loaned me their list, and they've been able to go back and look at the record. What a pyro-CB is a fire-driven thunderstorm. So I was listening to a guy on the radio talking about clouds going, cumulonimbus, so the queen of clouds, the greatest cloud, goes right through the troposphere into the stratosphere. You can't get a cloud more dramatic than that. Well, imagine a fire generating that. Well, what happened last summer is we got something over 30 of these pyro-CBs. So detectable at satellites because there's glaciation at the top of the cloud head. There's lightning, there's black hail, there's extreme tornadoes in some cases. Some people in California were killed. The fire truck was just picked up and just smashed to pieces by a vortex. These are atomic explosion scale things. They are going into the stratosphere. In fact, the smoke that was ejected from the Australian fires formed a coherent mass and travelled around the planet and did a lap around the planet. There's paper in Nature describing these things, saying, there's the only parallel to these fires is actually a major volcanic eruption. So what I'm trying to convey here is something incredibly crazy has happened, and it's on the back of the fact that we're seeing extreme, apocalyptic type fire behaviour in California. We're seeing, all sorts of signals, the Gondwanic rainforest here. I went to Chile. There's, fires that occurred in Chile, we have in our analysis, we looked at the 500 most energetic events on Earth in that satellite record, which for that previous slide. Well, we recalculated with the 2017 Chilean fires, and the top 500 was completely reorganised because in 1 week in Chile, exactly like that, there was this cluster of super extreme fire events burning in the Chilean forests. Enormous smoke pollution, not only, as I mentioned, being ejected into the stratosphere, which then, of course, starts affecting the Earth's climate, massive quantities of carbon dioxide, which comes back to this assumption, here in Tasmania, people saying, oh, well, we're carbon neutral because of our forests. I'm going, well, 25% of the forests of the landscape in Tasmania, not forests, vegetation has been burnt. I'm actually, we need to start calculating that carbon and how much has gone up into the atmosphere and how much is going to be able to be reabsorbed because the forests are under stress because of climate change. It might not necessarily, what goes up might not come down, which means that we're beginning to see a biospheric sink of carbon becoming a biospheric source, and the big biospheric source of carbon sink that could become a source, which is basically game over for us, is the boreal. If the boreal continues to burn, there's so much carbon up there, particularly in the organic soils, then humans, talking about 2-degree warming, as humans have completely lost control of the climate. They may never, whatever they do, they will just be responding to an Earth system that's in some sort of feedback driven by landscape fire. Now, there's one of the other studies that we did is that we actually, because I've been interested in smoke with Faye Johnston, We've been working on smoke health issues for 20 years, and we were immediately able to swing into action and calculate, look at that, it was about approximately a $2 billion health cost from the smoke effects. So these are, what I'm trying to do here, right, is I'm talking about the real world, okay? I'm talking about something very, very consequential and serious. Now consider, I was a guy just like bushwalking and nature and, just like, was curious about the world, I suppose. Never in my wildest dreams 40 years ago did I think I would be talking about this stuff, right? So I've been on a big journey. That is what I'm trying to convey. Point one. Point two, this is really serious, consequential business. If you don't believe me, read the Royal Commission report. This evidence, which we published in one of the leading journals in the world, the whole section in the Royal Commission about smoke health costs. So we're right up to our gills in, real world policy, complexity, which is sort of kind of good and kind of bad. So changing gear completely. Okay, I think I've established we have a problem. Now, maybe you're going to tell me there isn't a problem, or you just don't believe anything I say. Well, that's great. I don't want to dissuade you, enjoy it, because I guarantee you will feel the lash, if you haven't already, of fire. Probably from the smoke. And if you've been in Hobart, we had a major smoke event in 2019. There was, very significant impacts, and we've actually costed that out from that wildfire event. But also the taste of the lash is that you will know people here in Tasmania soon who will have their livelihoods and their properties and possibly their lives affected by uncontrolled fire. That is my absolute firm conviction. And I know that from everything that I've seen globally and nationally. This is a really significant, serious issue, I'm afraid to tell you. But if you don't believe me, that's fine. Just don't enjoy, because you'll get a cold shower sooner or later. So how do we think about fire? How do we think about this? I think I've laid out, I said I don't like problematizing. How do we think about this problem? What is fire? What is fire? Shut your eyes and think of the word fire. And actually, by the way, one of the things is whenever you think about fire, I can't see it here, but normally there's a little sign that, in a room, there'll be a fire exit, there'll be a fire extinguisher, there'll be we're actually quite aware of fire. We're quite afraid of it. We're so accustomed to thinking about it that we don't think about it, or we think about it in very particular ways. What I want to do now is actually blow your minds, because I'm going to make you think about fire in a completely different way, or think about fire in a multitude of ways. And that is the lead-in to pyrogeography. So you might think, as a scientist, fire is just a fundamental physiochemical process. Fire is just fire, and it's just simple, and it's just physics, or it's just chemistry, or it's both physics and chemistry. Well, that funny blue orb, guess what that is? That's a candle in space. Somebody in NASA said, let's have a flame in space, zero gravity. What's it look like? And what that is so deep and profound is that fire is actually immediately, you think about it, it has all of these properties of the earth, gravitational effects, buoyancy. Wherever you would go, if there's carbon life somewhere else and there's fire, the sorts of fire you would have would be different. And in fact, we know from Earth history, the sorts of fires in Earth history, because oxygen levels have varied significantly, that we know that the fires that have occurred in Earth history have been different. One of the things that many people don't realise is that a lot of our coal deposits are big bands of charcoal. And during times when oxygen have got up to about 35%, the atmosphere has been able to, wet things are burning. So you have these wet moss forests burning. And there's been times when the atmosphere has been very, sparse oxygen levels. And we've got this sweet spot at the moment that we think's normal, but it's not normal. It's just a condition of the amount of oxygen, the amount of gravity, and the amount of fuel. And the other thing that really happened inadvertently is when people started putting up spy satellites, weather satellites, the engineers were just like going, well, we're going to put up satellites into the sky and we're going to look down at the earth and we're going to, you know, do whatever we're going to do. And they go, what's that stuff down there? And they suddenly realised there's just fire everywhere. And this has led to, you know, probably the entry point of, you know, classical pyrogeography. There is actually a pattern of fire in the earth. The savannas burn, the rainforests aren't meant to burn, but they're being burnt because humans are clearing and burning them. But so you've got this sort of, you know, classic relationship between, you know, the sorts of fuels, the sorts of seasonality of the climate, which guess what? Seasonality of climate and vegetation, you know, vegetation types are described. We talk about a savanna environment or a rainforest environment. Those climates shape the sorts of fire activity. So you could actually classify, you know, vegetation, you could classify the life on Earth really according to the amount of fire activity. Some people have, they're called, you know, we talk about biomes, some people talk about pyromes, that they're these global patterns of fire activity. So the first thing is, you know, fire's not only specific to the planet, but the planet has a very particular sorts of metabolism or pattern of fire activity. So biological fire. So what an amazing thought that organisms have understood fire as a selective process of which they've had to evolve. Eucalyptus epicormic buds are a classic example. Some research we did about 10 years ago, long and involved story, but I became acquainted with a guy who was a plant anatomist, and they're pretty thin on the ground now, and he discovered that the Eucalyptus epicormic bud, the way it was in the textbook, classic thing, people had wanted to see what should be there, but it wasn't there. He'd actually started sectioning these buds, realised that actually the eucalyptus has a completely different anatomical solution to an epicormic bud. And then we did a large study in the Myrtaceae. We looked at, you know, cross-section across the eucalyptus and all the related genera in Myrtaceae, Syzygium, which you may know, cloves, the clove, you know, family, which Australia's got a number of species, Syzygiums, and, you know, both the stamen and all of, you know, Melaleuca, all of the things. And we then used molecular dating techniques to show that the epicormic bud in eucalyptus evolved 60 million years ago. Boom, just like that, we shot out of the sky the idea that Aboriginal fire use created a fire problem in the flammable environment. It's like, no, this is actually, you know, 60 million years is a long time. That's the Cainozoic, you know, that's a long time. These things have been evolving. And a number of other studies looking at Pinus and Banksia are all coming around the fact that it's very, very deep time evolutionary imprint. We suspect that probably fire adaptations go way, way, way back to, you know, to the beginning of really terrestrial life, because fire has been occurring on the planet since terrestrial life because of oxygen, because that's why terrestrial life's on the planet and the abundance of lightning. So ecological fire. So, well, what's that? Well, that's, I've been lucky to have been to Kruger National Park, Savannah, highly diverse, great for an Australian to see what a diverse, you know, mammal assemblage looks like, large mammals. And the thing about these systems is that, you know, the savannah is an environment which has basically got four pillars. It's got trees, it's got grass, it's got animals, it's got fire, and they all interact. And that's just how it is. And you manipulate those things, you're getting shifting patterns. And you see fire in a different way. You understand fire is actually embedded in an ecological web. In fact, I like to think of fire as being part of the food web. Atmospheric fire, I mentioned the pyroCBs. Fire can couple the land to the atmosphere, incredibly powerful way of transporting matter and vape, gases, water into the atmosphere. So that you can't think about the atmosphere without thinking about fire. You know, they're just connected, they just are. Geomorphological fire, southwest Tasmania, the patterning in southwest Tasmania is clear that you can see in a recently burnt area that the little fire sheltered nooks not getting burnt so much, the exposed ridges being burnt. So that results these feedbacks, which changes soils, changes patterns. In fact, geomorphological fire, after major fire events, one of the hazards now is that large quantities of debris are now flowing sometimes into cities, but certainly into water catchments. The famous Cotter catchment case, 2003, Canberra's water supply was compromised because the whole Cotter catchment was filled up with gunk. They had to, in real time, build a water filtration plant because that coupling of fire to a catchment. Fire culture. I've spent over 20 years working with Aboriginal people in Arnhem Land. I've become very close to an Aboriginal family. And it's one of the most fascinating things to be in country, people who still speak their language, very comfortable, and they're just walking around burning things, just like they always have. And, you know, one of the fringe benefits of this, my children all came on the field trip and grew up with the Aboriginal families' children, and they got in on the action. And it was really interesting to see that cultural framing, like children shouldn't be playing with fire. Children should be playing with fire, because if you want to understand fire, you've got to play with it. And, you know, the thought culturally, it's like, you know, it's like a visceral thing. Children shouldn't play with fire. But from an Aboriginal perspective, children should play with fire. It's completely normal. So then you start to encounter your own culture and your own norms, and you start opening yourself to other people's cultural norms. Fire diversity. Think, well, what's diversity got to do with it? Diversity's got everything to do with it. Exactly the same thing. There's this fantastic book, Gender and Wildfire, Christine Erickson, she's actually holding court. I had organised a lunch for women leaders in fire science at the university. It's part of like recognising this thing, you know, acknowledging it. I was sort of conflicted whether I should go along or not. I decided I'd go along. It was really fascinating. It was really interesting. And the thing, you know, that Christine made is just sort of like so obvious, her stories about how men and women, and of course, you know, if you had other axes of diversity, but just in this case, men and women, think about fire. Men and women die differently in fire events. Classically, men overestimate their capacities and generally get killed trying to do stupid things. And women often are talked into leaving late, and so they can die from trying to flee. So, you know, there's this whole thing. So if you're trying to communicate to the community about fire, you have to think about diversity. You can't just think. There's, in Christine's story, is a classic example that the Rural Fire Service had one uniform, just had one uniform. They didn't consider the fact that women might need a different sort of uniform than men. It didn't even occur to them that it's just, because it was so obvious to them that anybody who was fighting a fire would be wearing that sort of uniform. So those sorts of, I don't even know whether you would call them prejudices. They're just sort of assumptions. And then you have, you know, a guy like Nigel Clark is a really weird social scientist who's in the UK, you know, and he's writing about queer fire, ecology, combustion, and pyrosexual desire, you know, in the Feminist Review. I have no problem with that. I think that's fantastic, because what he's doing is pushing the boundaries of pyrogeographic thought. We can think about this however we like. Well, I don't really care whether I agree with it or not agree with it. I just think it's interesting that you could take something as so obvious as you all, thought you all knew what fire was. And it turns out that it's so not obvious, it's so complicated. And then there's Anthropocene fire. I love this image. This image is, in a sense, the trap closes. It's now being decommissioned, the Hazelwood Power Station, the coal mine fire that caught during the 2014 fire event. Coal seam got caught on fire. The company actually, which was a French company, I believe, took away all of the irrigation. Sparks landed on the coal bed, set fire to the coal bed. So here you've got the electricity, the CO2 pollution, climate change driven fires, the whole shooting match of the mess we're in. And in a lot of ways, that is Anthropocene fire. And I assume you know what the Anthropocene is. The Anthropocene is the idea that we're now in a different geological time, building from the Holocene. The Anthropocene is that humans are messing around with the earth. It's, I think, a really powerful metaphor. I don't know whether it's necessarily going to be, real geologically, and I don't believe that all humans are responsible for the mess we're in, but it's a nice idea. So in summary, fire is a complicated Earth system process. We wrote a review recently, and that is like, it's embedded in the whole shooting match, okay? So if you thought that fire was simple, hopefully I've helped you understand fire is not simple. Fire is very complicated. So the problem is that there is this web of biological and social interactions, processes and feedbacks. And on the one side, we've got a sort of a biophysical representation of the interactions of humans, CO2, climate, fire, vegetation, all of those things spiraling around. I might add that one of the holy grails in Earth system science is trying to project what future fire regimes are going to be. And one of the problems with this is that it involves humans. So any projection, just like the IPCC, you've got to suddenly have scenarios about what the humans are doing, what their economy is doing, and how much they're trying to fight fires. And then on the other side, we've got the interactions of climate change, humans, and human decision making, and fire protection, which creates all sorts of complex dynamics that makes understanding and managing fire very, very complicated. So my point being that if you really want to understand fire, if you really want to sign on to do this, then you've got to have a go at all of those things and more. And I invite you to look at my publication record, because I've given it a red hot go to try to understand this full complexity. You have to be pretty well crazy to try to do it, because it's so complicated. One of the lucky things that I've had is so many great collaborators. It's not to say throw away the norms of different disciplines. It's to press those different disciplines into service to understanding the complex problems that we have around fire. And that's really what I do and enjoy doing, trying to understand this complex set of things. So it's very difficult to pigeonhole, where should I fit in a university? Well, I don't know where I should fit, because, I could be in a geography department and I'm in a biological science department, but I collaborate with lawyers, I collaborate with people who are in public administration, I collaborate with anybody, economists, because it's all of those things are needed. Now, one of the weird things is that there's such a scarcity of transdisciplinary thought. And it's like, why is it the historians like Bill Gamage or the lawyers who, the landmark Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission or the recent Royal Commission into the last fires, which classically they come along and they go, right, we want to make sense of this. We need a master narrative, we need to make sense of it. What, and it had a lot to do with the Royal Commission. What ends up happening is they discover pyrogeography. That's what they do. They actually end up wanting to talk to climate scientists, they want to talk to lawyers, they want to talk to medical people, they want to think about, psychosocial inequality, they want to think about mental health, they want to think about insurance, they want to think about all of the things, it's basically they want to think about pyrogeography. That they always end up becoming pyrogeographers because the problem demands that. So I think I've established there's a real problem and it's a complicated problem. What I want to conclude with is some examples from my practice of trying to solve problems. Because you could say, oh, this guy's just problematized, says it's a really big problem, it's just another academic, doing what academics do. Well, what if you got this crazy academic who's actually really trying to do transformative things in the society? And you might ask me, I actually want to do some really transformative things, which maybe the society isn't ready for, to solve this problem. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples just to give you a flavour of where pyrogeographic thinking could take you. So cross-cultural action research, that's using sort of social sciencey words. Action research is when you embed yourself in a project and you're trying to get outcomes. But this is cross-cultural. And the story is we saw an opportunity through a whole lot of twists and turns to rekindle Tasmanian Aboriginal fire management. And, we know from the Midlands, you drive through the Midlands, it's one of the most humanised landscapes. In fact, we did some, very, very clearly a humanised landscape, incredible density of evidence of, it's the prime environment where the Tasmanian Aborigines occurred. And unfortunately, that's where, the frontier violence was inevitable. If you go to Bothwell, go and have a look at Fort Wentworth. Fort Wentworth. It's called Fort Wentworth. It was actually of Backland and Wentworth's brother, was the British officer. They built a fort. It was a red hot frontier. So what we did, it was an opportunity through my collaborations with the Tasmanian Aboriginal community and Julian von Bibra, who owns a large estate, including some of the last remaining remnant grasslands and woodlands. We cooked up this project where we reintroduced Aboriginal fire into his landscape some 200 years after it was expunged from that landscape. And it was a really interesting thing because the project wasn't a command and control gig. It actually self-assembled and evolved. The Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre actually made this awesome video about the project, which I can recommend you should have a look at. And it was just a really fascinating example of, rather than going, I'm a scientist, I have to do this experiment, I have to control everything. It's, I'm a scientist, I want to do an experiment, but I want to do it and I want to engage with other stakeholders, and I will bend to their will. And I will allow the project to be shaped in ways that are unexpected, including the creation of a video. That's pyrogeographic thinking, because I didn't go into this with a foregone, trust me, I'm the scientist, I have to control this. It's more, well, I'm engaging in a thing and we all have a common concern. And Julian's condition for me to do the experiment on his land was the engagement with the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. And what I did with the Tasmanian Aboriginal community is, you will provide the service and I will pay you for that. I'm not studying you. I'm studying the consequences of the fire. So totally different dynamic and I think a very successful and enjoyable project. So communication is another really key issue. So you've all heard of, double bind, somebody shouting at you, I love you, it's like, that's odd. Well, we have authoritarian and mixed messages, the political process, go, stop, the double bind. And the double bind in fire management is that, on the one hand, if you press 000, you expect somebody to go and put your house out. But if you press 000 during a bushfire, nothing's going to happen, because the condition, the social contract, is that at a certain point, emergency management no longer will provide for you. And if you don't believe me, there's no fine print. It's out in the open. Everybody's meant to have a plan. Everybody's meant to be responsible. But that's a really confusing message to have. On the one hand, 99.99% of the time my house catches on fire, some really heroic people come and put my house out during a catastrophic event, whereas nobody's going to come and help you. You're completely on your own. You have to take your own chances. You have to make your own decisions. That's a really big, confusing lot of philosophy there. And that is the doctrine. So I've thought a lot about this, and really it's this tension between a command and control and a people-centered. So command and control is, you will do what I say. And if you strongly communicate that, a lot of people will go, yeah, fine, okay, I'll do what you say. You tell me to evacuate, I'll evacuate. Tell me to do this, I'll do this, whatever you like. But you can't then expect people to take responsibility because you've told them to obey. If you want to make people-centered, to involve, this circle of, you have to empower people, you have to educate people, you have to enthuse people, you have to make people feel that they actually are part of the solution. So what we did is we built a smartphone app to manage smoke risk, because, as you know, planned burning, aerator, it's been a very successful app. Smoke pollutes catchments, and it creates problems for people, particularly people who've got asthma or other, vulnerabilities with breathing. And this aerator app actually was pressed into service during the smoke crisis in New South Wales. So it's been very successful. It's talked about in the Royal Commission. But a spin-off from that is that we're trying to build a community app called Firewatch, which is to help build community capacity in getting a shared concern, saying we can push information out that, it's spring, we need to start thinking about bushfires, or there is a fire in your vicinity, you need to start thinking about activating your plan, or here's some really good tools to build a plan, or this is a great place to store a plan. So we have been working with TasFire. We've run into a few, barriers. There's a lot of discussion at the moment around these fire apps, but we have something we're developing. We want to roll it out. We'll probably use it in an experimental sense. But I think that the way around that command and control issue is to disseminate information, to empower people so they can actually make their own decisions. So I think this is the last example of pyrogeographic thinking, is green fire breaks around Hobart. So Hobart is, has already distinguished as a city that nearly got burnt down. Very, very high likelihood it's going to be severely impacted by a fire soon. It's absolutely just the most hair-raising. Any international expert I take, Hobart, I show them around, they they just cannot believe that a city could be that vulnerable to a fire disaster. I had a woman, a Californian expert, who's in the insurance industry. I took her to Mount Wellington, she looked down, I have never seen anything like this, So it's not just me. I mean, it is a very vulnerable city. So one of the things we've got to do is we've got to start transforming the landscape. And by happen chance, after the 67 fire, a lot of fire breaks were bulldozed. They turned into then screen fire breaks, that the marsupials came and they created all these marsupial lawns. And so there's now discussion of making more of these marsupial lawns, thinning out the understory to reduce the risk of crown fire. So we started working with the City of Hobart, the council, and we started thinking about, well, how do people feel about this stuff? And, what about, the actual real fire risk? Let's start thinking about, how much fire risk is there, and how do people's perception of that fire risk, is it the same? Let's think about the worth of the interventions, biodiversity, the historical context. Let's use fire behaviour modelling and scenario planning. And we're currently doing a project funded by the Tasmanian government, working with the City of Hobart, actually trying to unpack all of these things. But some of our pilot work is that, you know, all of the managers said, don't ask people about clearing the bush around, you know, Hobart. They're just, you know, it's greeny central, they're not going to like it. You know, particularly the bushland suburbs, they're just not going to like it. Actually, you know, the respondents were, come and do it. You know, huge psychosocial stress. A lot of people in the bushland suburbs are just like transfixed with anxiety, you know, that, you know, there was this, and they actually, in our thing, they said, oh, we want a text box. We got something like 10 or 20 pages of just like people just pouring their heart out. And there was this couple of years ago now, 2019, you know, as a result of the recent fire season, we've made the decision to move from where we live to a location that is not in proximity to a large area of bush. It's just like, we're over it, we're out of here, we can't do it. City of Hobart, I do talks for them, and there's a classic thing. I gave a talk up at Fern Tree, and, you know, I didn't pull any punches, and apparently there were for sale signs, you know, you know, because, you know, I just said, basically, I said, you know, hands up who wants their house to burn down. And about, you know, a third of the people put their hand up. They said, well, it's in, and I understand that because that's amenity. They love that place. But I said, yeah, well, that's fine. And I get that. And that's terrific. And maybe you're Buddhists and you don't care whether everything going gets burnt down. And maybe you've got a bunker, maybe not. But what about the people, your neighbours, you know? And then, you know, John Fisher, the guy who works for the council, is pointing out, well, you're going to have to leave early, like really early, probably like the day before. You have to start thinking about the fact that you can't just ignore this, because if you're trapped up there, you will probably die. You know, so you have to think through that, you know, what sort of risk are you willing to take? So then, you know, this marsupial lawn question, suddenly, you know, green fire breaks are actually not negative. I talked to I'm very passionate about Knocklofty, the Glover painting, and I talked to the Friends of Knocklofty who've done a fantastic job weeding and planting trees. And I said, you know, but hey guys, you've only got 2 of the 4 pillars. You know, that's great that you're thinking about the herbaceous layer and you're thinking about the tree. What about the animals and what about the fire? You should be going around there burning the tussocks with a little blowtorch during winter. You should be husbanding your animals, you know. So a community group that's managing a bit of bushland, they think, you know, the classic, it's weeds and planting trees. It's not husbanding wildlife and husbanding fire. They haven't got to that point. And that leads into the renewal of Aboriginal Firescapes, because that's actually what Aboriginal Firescapes were. And I know that from working in Arnhem Land. You know, one Aboriginal elder told me, he was just like, we talked with linguists and it said, you know, one of the questions, you know, let's talk about fire. This guy just nailed it. He just said, fire is for kangaroos. You know, if I want to think about fire, it's for kangaroos. That's what I will use fire. Now, obviously, a woman would have a different, she might say fire is for yams, but an Aboriginal man, fire is for kangaroos. So that fits with what we know from anthropology. So what I'm really getting to is the vision thing. And that's where permaculture meets fire management. And at the moment, we're in this, and this is from a North American perspective, we're in this really dysfunctional place of, you know, fire bombers, houses burning down, you know, pregnant women being fumigated by smoke, you know, the whole thing is just a train wreck. And we can problematize, or we can say, look, actually, let's just step over here to the vision thing. We could actually create fire-safe communities. We can use our technology, we can warn people of smoke, we can have, you know, houses that are not so prone to being burned down, we can harvest the fuel, have bioenergy, and we can still have natural fire in the landscape. And we can save, you know, a monumental amount of money. And this is the thing. Can you get people to imagine driving firefighting out of business? So like say, imagine everything where there's just no firefighting. We go, what? There's no firefighting. because we're addicted to it. It's like bigger bombers, more bombers, got to have more bombers. But imagine if you go, let's just like have a situation, self-correcting system where you don't have any, like you just don't need it. And that's why Aboriginal children can run around and burn things, because they've got a fire-safe environment. They created an environment that was self-correcting. It just wasn't a dangerous environment. We've created an environment which is extraordinarily dangerous. And weirdly, I go up to Knocklofty, and the number of times I go up there and I go, I really want to burn this. I really want to burn this. Now, the weird thing is, if I was to burn it, I'm a criminal. I'm a criminal to burn that. But strangely, it's criminal. It's not being burnt, because it's actually just this bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger accumulating mass of fuel waiting to blow up. But we're in this thing, oh, that's fine. We'll just send in the helicopters and the water bombers and pay, you know, $50 million, $100 million to put the fire out. I might add, you know, the cost, as I mentioned, there's ballooning costs of firefighting. Same thing's happening now in Tasmania, where I think it was, I can't remember, it was 2000 and I can't remember, but the numbers jumped from, you know, 15 million to, in 2019, it was like 50. You know, it was a third, I think, of the Tas Fire budget was going on firefighting. You know, these massive quantities of money, 50 million. You know, for Tasmania, this is like serious money. So what's going to happen is, to do this, we're going to redesign our cities, settlements, we're going to change our life, and we're going to use herbivores, we're going to really replan. There's going to be a lot of discussion about this. Our societies are not ready for this. So what I want to do is take people on a journey, and the last part of my career is, you know, my challenge for myself is that I want to actually, at scale, transform some landscapes to make them fire safe, but to do it with informed consent, bring the society along, show people the historical precedent that, you know, one of the things, if you look at around Hobart, there's so much historical evidence that the landscapes have changed so much that it's like, well, yeah, we're changing the landscape, but you should see what the landscape was like, you know, the turn of last century. You know, it was like they denuded the place, you know, so, you know, these landscapes evolve, they're dynamic and they're going to change. And if we don't change them, these massive fires are going to come bearing down. The worst case scenario is Hobart's just going to be knocked over like 10 pins. It's just going to be wiped out. You know, that's, you know, I know that. You know, if you get a Pyro CB on top of Hobart, there is just, you know, look what it did to Nun Alley. So we really have to think about that. That's like the super worst case scenario. And we've got to, rather than frightening everybody into action, we say, look, this is an entirely soluble problem. Let's actually get on with the program. Let's start having some demonstration sites. Let's inform ourselves about the sorts of changes that have occurred, the sorts of changes that will occur because of climate change, and bring everybody into the story, including the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. And that's pyrogeographic thinking. That's actually the way you think about this problem. So one of the, probably the best, greatest academic honours in my career was a US firefighter who actually happens to have Native American descent, wrote to me and he said, I wrote a review article last year and he said, I'm on the front line fighting a fire. Here's a photo of me reading your article. You're the guy who's making sense of what I'm experiencing. Now, from my point of view, it doesn't get better than that. You know, this guy, you know, it's real. And to have somebody who's in reality saying, you're providing a framework, a coherence. So pyrogeographic thinking in the global fire crisis, it's problem solving, not problem framing. It's a complete gear change. And it hinges on transdisciplinary training, not putting people into boxes. As, oh, I can't think about that, I only do chemistry. It's like, well, get over it. You live in an environment, you know, your house is going to vulnerable to burning down. Think about how your chemistry can help solve that problem, or your psychology or your medical training or your social science, your art, anything. Clear objectives and really work with communities. And it's the diversity of practitioners, researchers and communities. Really bring in that diversity, because through that diversity, that's where you're actually going to throw up opportunities to have lots of people. Because it's, you know, if you have the, you know, the story of, you know, there's only one sort of firefighting uniform, one of the things that I've pointed out is that if you tell everybody to take responsibility, you know, for their house and prepare their house, well, it turns out, you know, there I've got a shack on Brenny Island, I'm up on a ladder, you know, trying to clear my gutters. And my partner, who's a medical doctor, amongst other things, she said, you know, according to Australian, you know, medical guidelines, people over 55 shouldn't be on ladders because there's a really high risk that you're going to fall to your death. And I actually know somebody who did die from falling off a ladder, and I didn't have a particularly good ladder. But the point is, well, if you're not able, what's the point of somebody shouting at you saying, clear out your gutters? You say, well, I want my gutters cleared out. I just can't do it. So that's where we have to start thinking about, you know, well, do we penalise these people for not cleaning out their gutters, or do we think of incentivising and creating, not only incentivising, but creating the demand in the economy where you can, you know, could you come and do my gutters, please? Yeah, sure, you know, just like you do your lawn. But at the moment, I can't find anybody who can do this stuff. It's just, it's not part of the economy. We're not thinking about it. So go back to that wonderful experience I had with the Tasmanian Aboriginal community and Julian von Bibber's land, and you know, it was such a unique thing. And it was really, you know, pyrogeographic thinking, pyrogeographic practice, pyrogeographic outcomes, that if you actually start thinking about this stuff, you can get the outcomes, you can make it happen. And I think I'll just end with, you know, the last bit where you know, well, what do I really believe? What do I really believe? How we're going to do this? I'll for the sake of conclusion, I'll wear my heart on my sleeve. And it came to me that really what we should be doing is we've got to affectionately, it's a wonderful word, affectionately means not mechanically, but not necessarily with sentiment. It could be with fear or pride, you know, but with actual human connection. Tend the earthly garden with little fires. That it's quite antithetical to the idea that it's all just a wilderness. No, we're engaged in this. There's a dynamic that we have to manage. Doesn't mean we're going to go and burn everything, but we have to manage the landscape. We have to manage fire. That's our human duty. Thank you.
That was, to say the least, a very, very stimulating talk. I think you touched everybody in the room with some, if not all aspects of it, David. Quite wonderful. And I know I will never think the same again as I like my barbecue. It was a wonderful exposition. We've got a little time for questions. Anyone's got a question, please put your hand up, and David will bring you the microphone. We're not allowed to pass microphones around in these COVID days, but he will bring them to you and you can talk into it. Please put your hands up. We've got time for a few questions.
You've given a very frightening perspective of what might happen in Hobart. What's your assessment of Launceston?
Yeah, I don't know Launceston that well. I'm getting to know Launceston more. And like all Tasmanian towns and cities, you know, it does have some significant patches of bush. And that's always a concern, you know, that we have to be thinking about. It's not to say we want to expunge them, we just have to be thinking about managing them. And, you know, I always come back to Dunalley. Dunalley was, you know, if somebody before 2013 said, I'm going to tell you where, you know, a spectacular you know, shocking fire disaster was going to happen. I just wouldn't have thought of Dunalley, and that was because some bushland, you know, big mountain or hill behind Dunalley caught on a very extreme fire, whether it was record-breaking temperatures, and then showered sparks into the settlement. And so this is the other problem of what's called ember attack. It's very serious. So part of the big retrofit process that we're going to go through with our housing stock is that we need to start looking at our existing housing stock in all of our towns and cities, and start trying to improve their fire safety. So I'm not an expert on Lonnie, I'm still learning about it, but I look at it, I think you're in better shape than Hobart, but still there's some pretty significant bush around the place, you know, it's surprisingly close. And it all just depends on, this is why it's sort of that weird thing, it all depends on the ignitions, you know, the worst case scenario. One of the things that people get confused about is the scale of fire. You don't need a really big fire to be very destructive. You can actually, small fires can be terribly destructive. If the ignition is at the wrong place at the wrong time, and you could imagine the gorge, you know, the winds and everything. I mean, you have to factor in what's likely, but you could imagine, you know, a suburb being severely impacted for sure.
Can I ask, what's your take on the big fire in America right now that's just burnt out those 12 coaches?
The
big fire that's in America right now that was reported on the news this morning, that's burnt out goodness knows how much part of the city, plus 12 coaches?
Well, I haven't heard about it. I haven't kept up with that, but it's just exactly this relentless, just relentless, you know, the statistics for America are just amazing. You know, it's like I can't even remember, you know, California had like the third, second and first largest fire seasons, you know, so it's just accelerating. And with that, and I was listening to the science show yesterday, and it's, you know, been said before, but the media is now understanding that, you know, polar bears and the barrier reef, fire is now also being used as an icon for climate change. But the key in the American situation is that there's a whole lot of other countervailing issues which make it harder to directly attribute to climate change, particularly smoky bear fire suppression and urban sprawl. So climate change is part of it, but also other social factors are part of it. But the reason the United States is so interesting is that it has the largest firefighting capacity of any country ever. And it's just, you know, and that's why I'm very, very worried in Australia that if we think we can fight fire the same way the Americans, because they're, you know, they're spending $2 billion a year on firefighting. They have these huge standing armies and air force, you know, they've got technology coming out their ears and the fires are still overwhelming them. So to answer your specific question, I haven't heard about that, but it's just further really underscoring what I'm saying. You know, this is a really, I honestly would love to be exaggerating about how dire the situation is, but it really is seriously dangerous. And we've got a very limited adaptation window. And one of the things I would like to have happen, we'd have to think about resourcing this, is I would like to think about, you know, to make certain that we don't go down the investing endlessly in more and more kit, that, you know, we have some sort of ratio that every dollar we spend on firefighting, we spend a certain amount on fire prevention and try to drive up the fire prevention capacity. And that's the problem in America, is that they've just invested so heavily, and it is a command and control thing. It's a totally different, they'd say, right, you've got to evacuate, you know, and then, so yeah, we're in a real, you know, there were fires in Siberia, you know, there's things happening in the boreal, which you may have heard about, this new geomorphological phenomenon, these craters that were suddenly appearing in the permafrost. I don't know whether you've heard about them, but they're methane exploding, and these huge fires that occurred in the Russian Siberia. So yeah, we've got a very limited time to adapt before I think we will. If we're not careful, we're going to be in a situation where we're just going to be like on the back foot, surviving as the fires are coming more and more aggressive. And it comes back to a local perspective in Tassie. We've seen a lot of fire activity, 2013, 2014, the Bass Strait Island, 2016, 2019. So there's this, you know, relentless growth is occurring just like America here. But we've been very, very lucky that there hasn't been more death and destruction. And, you know, the problem is our luck's going to run out. That's, so we, you know, we do have an opportunity. We've got lots of opportunities because we're a coherent society, done well with COVID, that we can, if we get our minds to this, we can solve this problem and work as a community. And I guess talks like this are all part of that.
After a fire event, is town planning going to change to make people do the changes we're supposed to have, like the distance between the housing and the bush, and how many trees they put in the garden and what they put in the garden? Are they going to listen?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So that's why there's a social science dimension to this. And what I've been talking to Anna Reynolds, the Lord Mayor of the City of Hobart, and a environmental consultancy, and we've just been kicking ideas around. And I think one of the things we need to do is learn a lot more about people's attitudes, because this thing, you know, I've got a deal for you, I'm a scientist, trust me, those days are over. In a post-truth environment, people don't necessarily, you know, they trust all sorts of things or they believe all sorts of things. So you have to go into your eyes open and build trust, but you have to incentivize. And I think what I would like to do is to say, okay, what do you think your fire risk is? And we can do an assessment, and we've got all of these changes you're going to have to do to your house and your garden, and we can tell you how much it costs. How much would we have to subsidise that for you to act on it? And I think that currently the Tasmanian government's considering a bushfire mitigation bill, which is quite intense, and very much, you know, all stick and no carrot. And I think that's, you know, you look at a complicated problem and you say, well, maybe we can just, you know, cut it down to a, you know, a legal, you know, blunt instrument. And I'm in my submission, I said, well, you know, really that's not going to work. There's got to be carrot. And so you might say, oh, this is just going to cost so much, you know, that's ridiculous. Imagine helping people fix their garden up. You go, but hang on, let's think about this. After a bushfire, there's all of this money. And during a bushfire, there's all of this money. You know, like those helicopters and planes you see flying around cost a lot of money. And even in the fire seasons, they're all on standby. They're costing a lot of money. We're spending a lot of money on bushfire fighting. So imagine taking a fraction of that money that we're already spending and incentivizing people to get on with the program and to actually to at least achieve the minimum. And I tell you what, if you like doing research, you do a little hobby research project, go to the TasFire website and find out about defendable space, you know, and what your house or a house should look like. Then go to Google Earth and look at Tasmanian towns and cities. And the mismatch is astonishing. They're just not in sync. So we have a problem. There's clearly most people aren't playing by the rules. So do we get a legal blunt instrument to try to drive them to be, you know, to be compliant, or do we have some of that? And obviously you do need rules, and have some incentives and education to try to encourage people to do the right thing. And the story of the latter, you know, it's like a lot of people just can't do this stuff. It's just physically not it's just not possible for them to do the things. They don't have the means, they're not physically suited to do that work, or they're too time poor. They've got lots of money, they just don't have any time. You know, so working that out, if we could incentivize, what we would also do is to drive capacity in the economy and drive a new niche in the economy where, you know, you want your lawn mowed, you can get Jim's mowing. If you want your house fire safe, you can go to somebody and say, come and fix my house. You know, I can't stand it, or my shack, you know, I just want this sorted out. And I've got a shack on Bruny Island and I want my shack sorted out. I just can't get anybody to help me, you know. There's just no capacity in the economy at the moment. There's a, you know, miniature building boom occurring, and, you know, like builders are flat out, like, you know, so we do our best, but I know that I'm underachieving and I'm happy to spend the money, you know, because it's just that sector, the economy isn't developed.
I didn't explain at the beginning of this meeting, but you look like you're half an audience all sitting apart. Well, in fact, you are, because as well as all of you good people that are here face to face, we've got an audience on Zoom. About the same number of people are taking this lecture electronically, and we've got 2 questions that they have addressed because they're able to, and I'd be grateful if you could answer them, David. We've got time for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, David. The first question here is from Jocelyn. Question is, using fire as was done by Aboriginal people before invasion probably had minimal impact on the atmosphere, but what about today? Is it not irresponsible to be lighting fires now out of curiosity or for an experiment after 200 years of the atmosphere having been modified? Little fires might work if there weren't all the other big fires and other sources of CO2.
So the question really gets to the heart of managing carbon emissions from forests. That's really the question. And one of the things that we're going to have to work through is to work out the trade-offs. And there's a lot of debate about, you know, if you have cool fires, can you reduce the likelihood through planned burning of major emissions rather than fire suppression? And it's a very complicated problem, but we suspect that under Aboriginal style management or recreating an Aboriginal firescape, you could reduce the likelihood of a severe fire and reduce the amount of carbon emissions. But that's a very, very complicated piece of research that we need to do. So I do take the point, but we're going, and I think more fundamentally, a much bigger point that everybody should be thinking about is that the idea, and when, you know, carbon economy was being first thought about and the Kyoto protocols, it was just assumed that fire was self-correcting, that what would be burnt and emitted would be reabsorbed by regrowing vegetation. And there's increasing evidence that that's not happening. And I think that there's some real opportunities here in Tasmania. Every time I see a regen burn, putting all of that smoke and greenhouse gas after a forest has been logged, I just go, that just doesn't seem right to me. That energy and that carbon, it concerns me that, I mean, it's a drop in the bucket globally, but it concerns me, you know, is that the best use of that energy and that carbon, just burning a fire to regenerate a forest? Should we be doing something else with that carbon? And you go, yeah, okay, I get it, you know, biodiversity and beetles and logs and all the rest of it. But if you start doing the calculus, we have to be thinking about, you know, the emissions and the benefit that we're getting versus, you know, the emissions. So thinking that through, but I suspect, you know, if we harvest understories, we can make the likelihood of extreme fires, reduce the likelihood, increase the amount of carbon storage, increase the resilience of our landscapes.
And thank you. And just our second and our final question is, how do we go about restoring the cultural knowledge of Aboriginal learning now that we have successfully extinguished it through our past historical actions?
Yeah, so this is I've talked to Greg Lehman, who's the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Indigenous University, and Tasmanian Aboriginal, very thoughtful person, and he talked about connoisseurship, and I really like that. And it's like, you know, this whole thing that you can get trapped into, well, that's not authentic, you know, like, but then what's authenticity? And that that statement I had, you know, affectionately tending the earthly garden as little fires. I was in France at a conference, and a chap gave this amazing talk, a historian, where he discovered that a magistrate in a province in the middle of the 19th century had become interested in the way, it was a highly educated man who was sent to a province, and there were these folk traditions of people using fire in France for all sorts of reasons, to make mushrooms and collect acorns and, you know, tend sheep and all the rest of it. And petite feu, the little fires. That was the phrase, the petite feu, the little fires. And what it hit me right between the eyes is, I have a tradition of fire. You know, from my genes, I'm from the British Isles. You know, my ancestors used fire, because I'm half Scottish, you know, to maintain heather. So many Europeans have a tradition of little fire as much as Aboriginal people. And I think that what we have to be careful of is, you know, and you could say, well, you were party to that, to go to Arnhem Land, because when I was first thinking about these questions, people, there's nothing to see here. And I wrote a paper about the role of Aboriginal fire use in Tasmania in 1984, I might add. And I ended up in Arnhem Land, you know, and you could say, well, that's authentic, you know, authentic fire. But actually, the Aboriginal people use butane lighters, they drive around in Toyotas, they have a cosmology that involves buffalo. You know, you realise that, you know, Aboriginal people are very, very adaptive, just like all people. They adapt to circumstances. So we shouldn't be trying to drive back to some idealised state. Rather, we should be syncretic. And I think that one of the exciting opportunities is to say all cultures have a fire culture. And so just as much as rekindling Tasmanian Aboriginal traditions, there's also an opportunity for a rapprochement where we can take, you know, our ideas from the Western tradition of science and also our deeper latent culture about fire and bring them all together. So syncretic. One of the things that I would really love to do in Hobart is to have a fire festival involving burning a hill. It's like a symbolic gesture every year, you know, would make everybody aware that they're in this landscape that is designed to burn and have this deep history of burning. And it could be a way of bringing the community together and focusing. Yeah, we could involve Aboriginal people, take leadership of that, but to have everybody involved in it. So we're creating a new fire culture. And you might think that's a completely crazy idea. Well, I got the idea from going to Kyoto, because Kyoto, they've got a big character on the hill, which every year they brand into the hill. It's a Chinese character or a Japanese character for great. And they have this ceremony, and it's a way of marking time and show. And I just think, you know, it's such a potent way of human showing their connection to fire and acknowledging their landscape and their setting. And that we could sort of do that too. We can make it up. In other words, I'm told, my father told me actually a lot of the tartans, he was Scottish, that that's true. The clans did have designs, but a lot of it was during the Victorian times, it was formalised and it was sort of invented a bit. And the bagpipes, it was all a bit of an invention, but that's okay because cultures evolve. So we've got an opportunity here in Tasmania to basically create in our cultural renewal and our reconciliation with the Indigenous people, we can find a middle ground and we can create a really exciting contemporary culture, which most importantly for culture and cultural survival is bringing in the next generation, bringing in people to be concerned about these things and transmitting cultural knowledge into the future. And I think that could be really exciting. You know, just it's something we should be talking about.
Thank you very much, David. I'm sorry we haven't got any more time for questions, but we do need to give the staff time to clean all the chairs and stack them. No, we don't have to do anything with the chairs as we used to previously, but we do have to give them the time to do it. David, I am sure we could not have started off our 2021 lecture series with a more brilliant, thought-provoking and relevant dissertation than you've given us today. I'm sure it's certainly covered an incredible range of subjects, of ideas, of thoughts. I'm quite sure that everyone here will be going away thinking about some aspect, if not all, of what you've talked to us about today. You mightn't have wanted to frighten us, but by gosh, you frightened me. We'd like to, just to mark the occasion, a small certificate with the history of the society on the back, and a little light reading if you can take your mind off the fire situation and the way you spoke with such dedication and such earnestness. I think you probably even dream fires. But we would thank you very, very much for being our guest today. It has been a brilliant, brilliant start to our year. Thank you. The the next thing is a little bit of housekeeping. We've got some material, some beautiful cards for sale, and we've still got a few calendars. I think they're still relevant for another 10 months anyway. So if anyone hasn't got one, we've got some membership forms there. We would love to sign you up. It's only $10 a year. It's nothing. And but more particularly, the next meeting we have here on the 28th of September, the 28th of March, Sunday the 28th of March, will be preceded by our annual general meeting. And there are forms, nomination forms available as you leave for anyone that would like to put their name forward to be to take office or be part of the committee. It's not an arduous job. We only meet about, well, strictly every 3 months, but sometimes a little more if it's needed. But we would love to have some new people come on to the Royal Society Northern Tasmania Management Committee. The next program after we have the AGM, that will be at 1:15, and at the usual 1:30 time, we will have, I've lost it now. Oh, I haven't. Here we are. Yes, Professor Katie Flanagan. You all know Katie, and she is going to give us global and Australian perspectives for COVID-19. And this fire talk was relevant, but this next one's going to be very relevant too to every one of us. So I recommend that you come along, come to our annual general meeting, and then stay and hear Professor Katie Flanagan talking all about COVID. I'm sorry that we can't provide you with the usual cup of tea and a bicky. Again, COVID restrictions prevent us from catering and for people mixing as close as that, so I'm sure that you understand. Again, it's lovely to have you here, Mary Kuloff, and husband Jared. It's great that you should have taken the time to come here. We're very grateful, and I hope you've enjoyed the talk as much as I have. I think I'm hoping you're going away highly impressed. That is all we need to do. As I said, we don't need to move the chairs. Thank you all very much. I think I've covered all the matters that we need, and I wish you all a very safe trip home. Thank you for coming, and do look after yourselves, be COVID safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next month.